The morning sun was shining through the tall windows of the fancy office building downtown. 22-year-old David Johnson walked through the marble lobby, his new black shoes clicking on the polished floor. He was still getting used to wearing expensive suits every day. Just 3 months ago, he was a broke law student eating ramen noodles for dinner. Now he worked at one of the city's most important law firms. David took the elevator to the 20th floor. The doors opened to reveal a world of dark wood panels, expensive artwork, and lawyers in $1,000 suits. He still felt like he didn't belong here. Maybe it was because he was the youngest person in the office. Maybe it was because he grew up in a small apartment with his grandmother, while most of his coworkers came from wealthy families. Or maybe it was because he was one of only 3 people who looked like him in the entire building. His desk was in the corner, away from the important offices. The other new lawyers got better spots, but David didn't complain. He was just happy to have the job. Every morning, he arrived early and stayed late, hoping to prove himself worthy of being there. Today was different, though. Today he was going to sit in on his first big business meeting. Mr. Thompson, one of the senior partners, had told him to bring a notepad and keep quiet. "You're here to learn, not to talk," Thompson had said with a serious look. The conference room was like something from a movie. The table was so shiny you could see your reflection in it. Expensive leather chairs surrounded it, and paintings that probably cost more than David's yearly salary hung on the walls. Large windows showed the city skyline, making everyone in the room feel important and powerful. David took his seat in the back corner, as far from the main action as possible. He opened his notepad and checked his pen twice. His grandmother had always told him to be prepared for any opportunity, even if it seemed small. The room began to fill with people in expensive suits. The lawyers from David's firm entered first, looking confident and relaxed. These were men who had been doing big deals for decades. They knew how to make millions of dollars change hands with just a few signatures. Then came the other side. A young couple walked in looking nervous and excited. At the same time, the man was probably in his early 30s with messy hair that showed he spent more time working on computers than styling it. The woman beside him wore a simple dress and kept checking her phone nervously. David could tell they weren't used to rooms like this. Behind them walked a man who commanded attention the moment he entered. He was tall with perfectly gray hair and a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. His smile was wide, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. This was Harrison Blake, the boss of Nexus Corporation, one of the biggest technology companies in the world. Blake's team followed him in, 5 lawyers in identical dark suits carrying identical briefcases. They moved like a small army, organized and ready for battle. David watched them set up their papers and laptops with military precision. The nervous couple sat across from Blake's team. David learned they were Tom and Lisa Chen, the founders of a small technology company called Innovate Tech. They had created some kind of smart computer program that could help other computers think better. David didn't understand all the technical details, but he could see this was the biggest moment of their lives. Mr. Thompson started the meeting by shaking everyone's hands and making small talk about the weather. But David could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't really about being friendly. This was about money. Lots of money. "So," Blake said, his voice smooth as silk, "I think we're all excited to make this deal happen today. Innovate Tech has built something truly special, and Nexus wants to help them share it with the world." Tom and Lisa smiled at each other. They had started their company in their garage 3 years ago, working 18-hour days and living on pizza and coffee. Now one of the world's biggest companies wanted to buy their invention for $30 million. It felt like a dream come true. Blake's assistant placed a thick stack of papers in front of the couple. "Here's the contract," Blake said with his practiced smile. "Everything we discussed is in there. $30 million plus you both get to stay on as employees to keep working on your project." David watched as Tom and Lisa's eyes went wide looking at all the pages. The contract was at least 2 inches thick, filled with tiny text and complicated legal language. Most people would need days to read through it all properly. "Don't worry about all the legal stuff. one of Blake's lawyers said with a friendly laugh. It's mostly standard language that we use in all our deals. The important parts are right here on the first few pages. David saw Tom flip through the contract quickly, his eyes glazing over at all the complicated words. Lisa looked overwhelmed too. They were brilliant inventors, but they weren't lawyers. They trusted that the adults in the room were looking out for their best interests. Mr. Thompson and the other senior lawyers from David's firm were already talking about celebration drinks. They seemed more interested in finishing the deal quickly than actually reading what their clients were about to sign, but David had nothing else to do except read. While everyone else was making small talk and checking their phones, he found himself actually looking at the contract. Page by page, he worked through the dense legal language that he had spent 3 years learning to understand. Most of it was standard business language, just like Blake's lawyer had said. But as David got deeper into the document, he started to notice things that didn't seem right. Little phrases hidden in paragraphs full of boring legal words. Sentences that seemed to say one thing on the surface but actually meant something completely different. On page 47, buried in a section about employment terms, David found something that made his blood run cold. Section 47C, subsection 3 was written in a way that looked harmless at first glance. But when David read it carefully, he realized what it really meant. The clause said that Nexus could fire Tom and Lisa for any reason within 6 months of signing the contract. Not only that, but if they were fired, Nexus would keep complete ownership of their invention, plus any new ideas they came up with in the future. Basically, Nexus could take their money back, steal their life's work, and leave them with nothing. David read the section 3 more times to make sure he understood it correctly. His hands started to shake as he realized what was happening. This wasn't a fair business deal. This was a trap designed to steal everything Tom and Lisa had worked for. He looked around the room. Blake was laughing at something Tom had said, playing the part of the friendly businessman perfectly. The senior lawyers were already planning their expensive dinner celebration. Tom and Lisa were holding hands under the table, probably imagining what they would do with $30 million. Nobody else had noticed the trap hidden in the contract. Nobody else was actually reading the fine print. They were all so focused on the big numbers and the fancy celebration that they missed the most important part. David felt sick to his stomach. He watched as someone brought in a bottle of champagne and expensive glasses. Blake raised his glass in a toast to new partnerships and bright futures. Tom and Lisa clinked glasses with him, smiling wider than David had ever seen anyone smile. To innovate tech, Blake said, and to the exciting journey ahead. David saw Tom reach for a pen to sign the contract. His wife Lisa was already reaching for her own pen, ready to sign their names on the dotted line that would change their lives forever. But not in the way they thought. The room was full of laughter and celebration. Blake's smile was wider than ever as he watched the couple prepare to fall into his carefully laid trap. His lawyers sat back in their chairs, looking satisfied with their work. The senior partners from David's firm were already talking about the big commission they would earn from this deal. Everyone was happy. Everyone was celebrating. Everyone except David, who sat in his corner chair with his notepad, knowing that he was about to watch two good people lose everything they had worked for. His heart was beating so fast he thought everyone could hear it. His palms were sweaty, and his mouth felt dry. He was just a junior lawyer, fresh out of school, sitting in a room full of powerful people who had been doing this for decades. Who was he to speak up? Who was he to question a deal that everyone else seemed to think was perfect? But as he watched Tom's pen get closer to the signature line, David knew he couldn't stay silent. His grandmother had raised him to always stand up for what was right, even when it was scary. Especially when it was scary. The champagne bubbles sparkled in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the big windows. The room smelled like expensive leather and success. Everyone was about to become richer and more powerful. Except for Tom and Lisa, who were about to lose everything without even knowing it. David's hands were shaking as he watched Tom lean forward with his pen. The black ink was just inches away from the signature line that would ruin his life. Lisa was smiling at her husband, completely unaware that they were about to walk into The biggest trap of their lives. The champagne glasses were still sparkling in the afternoon light. Everyone in the room looked so happy and relaxed. Blake was telling a funny story about his first big business deal, making everyone laugh. The senior lawyers were nodding and smiling, already thinking about their big payday from this contract. David felt like he was watching a car accident happen in slow motion. He could see the disaster coming, but everyone else was blind to it. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure people could hear it across the room. Sweat was forming on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. He looked down at his notepad, where he had written down the section number, 47C, subsection 3. Those simple numbers and letters represented thousands of hours of Tom and Lisa's hard work that was about to be stolen from them. Their dreams, their future, their life savings, all of it would disappear the moment Tom signed his name. "This is such an exciting day," Lisa said, her voice full of joy. "We never imagined 3 years ago that we'd be sitting in a room like this." Blake nodded warmly. "That's the beauty of American innovation," he said. "Two smart people with a great idea can change the world." David almost laughed at the irony. Blake was talking about innovation and dreams while preparing to crush those exact things. But nobody else seemed to notice. They were all caught up in the moment, the celebration, the promise of easy money. Tom clicked his pen and placed it on the paper. "Where do we sign?" he asked. "Right there on page 1, Blake's lawyer pointed helpfully. "Both of you just need to sign an initial, and we'll be all done." David watched in horror as Tom positioned his pen over the signature line. This was it. In 5 seconds, it would all be over. Tom and Lisa would sign away their future without even knowing it. Blake would get exactly what he wanted. And David would have to live with himself knowing he could have stopped it but didn't. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head. "Baby," she used to say, "there comes a time in every person's life when they have to choose between what's easy and what's right. That choice shows who you really are." David had always thought he was a good person. He went to church with his grandmother every Sunday. He helped his neighbors. He studied hard and followed the rules. But sitting in that leather chair, watching 2 innocent people about to be destroyed, he realized that being good wasn't just about following rules. Sometimes being good meant breaking them. "Excuse me," David said quietly. His voice was so soft that nobody heard him over the conversation and laughter. Tom was still holding his pen, talking to Lisa about what color they should paint their new house. Blake was checking his expensive watch, eager to finish the deal. David cleared his throat and spoke louder. "Excuse me?" A few people glanced in his direction, but the conversation continued. Mr. Thompson gave him a sharp look that clearly said, "Stay quiet." The other senior lawyers didn't even acknowledge that he had spoken. David felt his face getting hot. His mouth was dry and his hands were trembling. Every instinct in his body told him to stay quiet, to keep his head down, to let the adults handle adult business. He was just a kid from the wrong side of town who got lucky enough to land this job. Who was he to interrupt a multi-million-dollar deal? But then he looked at Tom and Lisa again. They reminded him of his neighbors back home. Good, hard-working, people who trusted that the system would treat them fairly. People who believed that if you worked hard and played by the rules, everything would work out. David knew better. He had seen too many good people get taken advantage of by powerful people who had more money and better lawyers. He had watched his grandmother work 3 jobs to pay rent while rich landlords got richer. He had seen friends give up their dreams because they couldn't afford to fight the system. Tom's pen was touching the paper now. In seconds, it would be too late. "Excuse me, but this clause is a trap," David said loudly. The entire room went silent. The laughter stopped. The champagne glasses froze halfway to people's lips. Every single person in that expensive conference room turned to look at the young lawyer sitting in the corner. Tom's pen stopped moving. Lisa looked confused. Blake's friendly smile flickered like a light bulb about to burn out. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Blake asked. His voice was still polite, but there was something cold underneath it now. David stood up on shaky legs. His notepad fell to the floor, but he didn't bend down to pick it up. He had committed now. There was no going back. Section 47C, subsection 3, David said, pointing at the contract. This clause gives Nexus the right to fire both of you within 6 months for any reason they want. And if they fire you, they keep all the money and all the rights to your invention. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Tom and Lisa looked down at their contract with wide eyes, suddenly realizing they had no idea what they were about to sign. That's... Blake started to say, but his voice trailed off. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, and Blake's face got a little red. That's quite an interpretation, Blake finally said, his smile completely gone now. Perhaps we should let the experienced lawyers handle the contract review, but it was too late. David had opened the door, and the truth was flooding out. Wait, Tom said, flipping through the thick contract. Where's this section? I want to read it myself. Page 47, David said quietly. Lisa grabbed her own copy of the contract and started flipping pages frantically. Her hands were shaking as she searched for the section David had mentioned. Mr. Thompson stood up quickly. Now hold on, he said in his most professional voice. I think there might be some confusion here. David is very new, and sometimes new lawyers can misinterpret standard contract language. But Tom had found page 47. He was reading section 47C with his finger following each word carefully. His face was getting paler by the second. Is this right? Tom asked, looking up at Blake. Does this really say you can fire us and take our invention back? Blake's lawyers were shuffling papers and whispering to each other. Blake himself was staring at David with a look that could freeze water. Legal contracts are complex documents, Blake said carefully. There are always various contingencies and standard protections that companies need to include. That's not an answer, Lisa said firmly. She had found the section too and was reading it with growing horror. This says you can take everything from us whenever you want. The celebration atmosphere was completely gone now. The champagne sat untouched. The expensive sandwiches remained on their silver trays. Everyone was focused on the contract that had seemed so wonderful just minutes before. David watched Blake's face change as he realized his perfect plan was falling apart. The friendly businessman mask was slipping away, revealing something much colder underneath. This is highly irregular, Blake said, his voice getting sharper. We've been negotiating this deal for months. Everything has been agreed upon. Not everything, Tom said, still reading the contract. We never agreed to give you the right to steal our company. That's a very strong word, one of Blake's lawyers said smoothly. This is simply standard business language that protects both parties. Protects you, maybe, Lisa shot back. But what does it do for us? David could see that Tom and Lisa were starting to understand what had almost happened to them. The excitement and joy on their faces was being replaced by anger and fear. Blake stood up abruptly. I think we need to take a break, he said. Perhaps everyone should cool down and we can discuss this rationally. There's nothing to cool down about, Tom said, closing the contract firmly. We're not signing this. Now wait just a minute, Mr. Thompson said quickly. Let's not make any hasty decisions. This is a very good deal for everyone involved. Good. For who? Lisa asked pointedly. David watched the senior lawyers from his own firm try to salvage the situation. They were sweating now, realizing that their big commission was slipping away. More importantly, they were about to lose one of their biggest clients. Blake looked directly at David with eyes full of cold anger. And I'll be sure to remember who made this interpretation possible, he said slowly. David felt a chill run down his spine. That wasn't just disappointment in Blake's voice. That was a threat. Blake was telling him that there would be consequences for what he had just done. The powerful businessman gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements. His team of lawyers followed his lead, packing up their identical briefcases without saying another word. This meeting is over, Blake announced. When you're ready to discuss this deal seriously, you know how to reach us. As Blake and his team walked toward the door, Tom called out, We are discussing it seriously. That's why we're not signing it. Blake paused at the door and turned back one last time. His eyes found David again. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Very interesting." Then, he was gone, taking his lawyers and his trap contract with him. The conference room felt like a cemetery after Blake and his team left. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. David stood in his corner, still shaking from what he had just done. The expensive champagne sat flat and forgotten on the table. The celebration sandwiches looked sad and untouched on their silver trays. Tom and Lisa were still sitting at the big table, staring at the contract like it was a poisonous snake. They were flipping through pages, finding more and more hidden traps that would have destroyed their lives. Every few minutes, one of them would point to another section and shake their head in disbelief. "Look at this part," Lisa whispered to her husband. "They would have owned everything we create for the next 10 years, even if we quit and started a new company." Tom rubbed his forehead like he had a terrible headache. "We almost signed this," he said quietly. "We were 30 seconds away from losing everything." The senior lawyers from David's firm were having their own quiet conversation by the windows. Mr. Thompson kept glancing at David with a look that could melt steel. The other partners were whispering angrily among themselves, occasionally pointing in David's direction. David knew he was in serious trouble. He had just cost his law firm millions of dollars in fees. Worse than that, he had embarrassed them in front of one of their biggest clients. Blake wouldn't just take his business elsewhere. He would probably tell every other big company in the city that Thompson and Associates couldn't be trusted to keep their junior lawyers in line. "David," Tom called out suddenly. "Come over here." David walked slowly to the main table, his legs feeling like jelly. He was sure Tom was angry at him for some reason. Maybe for not speaking up sooner. Maybe for causing such a scene. But when Tom looked up at him, his eyes were full of gratitude, not anger. "Thank you," Tom said simply. He stood up and grabbed David's hand, shaking it firmly. "You just saved our lives." Lisa stood up too and gave David a hug. "We had no idea," she said, her voice shaky with emotion. "We trusted everyone in this room to look out for us, and you were the only one who actually did." David felt a lump forming in his throat. These were good people who had worked so hard to build something special. They deserved better than to be tricked by someone like Blake. "I couldn't just sit there and watch," David said quietly. "Most people would have," Tom replied. "Most people would have stayed quiet to protect themselves." From across the room, Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, loudly. "David, I think it's time for you to return to your office. Tom and Lisa, perhaps we should schedule another meeting to discuss your options going forward." David understood the message. He was being dismissed, sent away so the adults could clean up the mess he had made. As he walked toward the door, Lisa called out to him again. "David, do you have a business card? We'd like to keep in touch." David felt his face get hot. "I'm just a junior associate," he said. "I don't even have my own business cards yet." Tom pulled out his phone. "What's your number? We want to stay in contact with you." After David gave them his information, he left the conference room and walked slowly back to his small desk in the corner. The rest of the law firm seemed to be buzzing with activity, but David felt like he was moving through underwater. Everything seemed slow and strange. He sat down at his desk and stared at his computer screen without really seeing it. His hands were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He kept replaying the moment when Blake's smile disappeared and his eyes turned cold and angry. About an hour later, David's phone rang. It was his grandmother. "Hey, baby," she said in her warm, familiar voice. "How was your day at that fancy job?" David almost started crying right there at his desk. "It was complicated, Grandma." "Complicated how?" David looked around to make sure nobody was listening, then told his grandmother the whole story in a quiet voice. About the contract, about the trap, about speaking up when everyone else stayed quiet. When he finished, there was silence on the other end of the line for a long moment. "David," his grandmother finally said, "I am so proud of you I could burst. But, Grandma, I might get fired. I probably just ruined my career before it even started. Baby, let me tell you something. A career built on staying quiet while good people get hurt isn't worth having. You did the right thing, and that's all that matters." David felt a little better after talking to his grandmother. But the feeling didn't last long. Around 3 o'clock, his phone rang again. This time it was Mr. Thompson's secretary. "Mr. Thompson would like to see you in his office immediately," she said in a voice that sounded like she was announcing a funeral. David walked slowly down the hall to the biggest office on the floor. Mr. Thompson's office had windows on 2 sides, expensive artwork on the walls, and a desk the size of a small car. Behind that desk sat one of the most powerful lawyers in the city, and he did not look happy. "Sit down, David," Mr. Thompson said without looking up from the papers on his desk. David sat in the leather chair across from the desk and waited. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes. "Do you know how long I've been practicing law?" Mr. Thompson finally asked. "No, sir. 37 years. In that time I've learned that there are rules to this business. Unwritten rules that keep everything running smoothly." David nodded, not sure what else to do. "One of those rules is that junior associates observe and learn. They don't speak unless spoken to. They certainly don't contradict senior partners or embarrass important clients." "Yes, sir, I understand." Mr. Thompson finally looked up at David. His face was tired and disappointed. Do you really understand what you did in that room today?" "I stopped 2 people from being cheated," David said quietly. "You cost this firm a 7-figure client relationship," Mr. Thompson shot back. "Blake Enterprises has been working with us for 15 years. They trust us to handle their deals professionally and discreetly. But the contract was unfair. David, fairness is not our job. Our job is to represent our client's interests within the bounds of the law. Blake's contract was perfectly legal." David felt his anger rising. "Legal doesn't mean right." Mr. Thompson sighed heavily. "That's exactly the attitude that's going to get you in trouble in this business. You're not a social worker, David. You're a lawyer. Your job is to do what your clients ask you to do, not to judge whether it's morally perfect." "So I should have just stayed quiet? Let Tom and Lisa sign that contract without knowing what it really meant?" "Tom and Lisa had their own lawyers. It wasn't your responsibility to protect them. But their lawyers weren't reading the contract either. Nobody was protecting them except me." Mr. Thompson stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city skyline. "David, I'm going to be very clear with you. This firm values loyalty, discretion, and professionalism above all else. What you did today showed none of those qualities." David felt his heart sinking. He knew what was coming next. "However," Mr. Thompson continued, "I'm not going to fire you. Yet." David looked up in surprise. "You're a smart lawyer, David. Smarter than most of the people we hire. But intelligence without judgment is dangerous, so I'm transferring you to our document review department." David's heart sank even further. Document review was where law firms sent lawyers to die. It meant sitting in a basement office reading thousands of boring papers, looking for tiny details that might be important to some case. No client contact, no court appearances, no chance for advancement. "How long?" David asked quietly. "Until you learn to keep your mouth shut and follow directions," Mr. Thompson replied. "Could be 6 months, could be 6 years. That's entirely up to you." David nodded slowly. He understood the message perfectly. Shut up and play along, or spend the rest of his career in the basement. "One more thing," Mr. Thompson added as David stood to leave. "Blake called me personally after he left. He was very unhappy about what happened today. He specifically mentioned your name." "What did he say?" "He said he'll remember you. In this business, David, that's not the kind of attention you want from someone like Harrison Blake." David left Mr. Thompson's office feeling like he had been hit by a truck. As he walked back to his desk to pack up his things, he passed the conference room where everything had happened. The room was empty now, but he could still picture Tom reaching for his pen, about to sign away his future. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Tom. "Lisa and I wanted to thank you again. We found another company to work with, one that offered us a fair deal. None of this would have been possible without your courage today. You're a hero." David smiled for the first time all day. Maybe Mr. Thompson was right. Maybe he had ruined his career at this fancy law firm. Maybe Blake would make sure he never worked for another big company again. But Tom and Lisa still had their dreams. They still had their invention. They still had their future, and sometimes David thought that was worth more than any career. 6 months had passed since that day in the conference room, and David's life had changed completely. Every morning he took the elevator down to the basement instead of up to the 20th floor. The basement had no windows, no expensive artwork, and no leather chairs. Just rows of old desks, buzzing fluorescent lights, and stacks of papers that seemed to multiply overnight. David's new job was simple but mind-numbing. He sat at a small desk for 10 hours a day, reading through thousands of documents looking for anything that might be important to the firm's cases. Most days he found nothing. The papers were usually boring business emails, old contracts, or financial records that had nothing to do with anything important. His co-workers in document review were mostly other lawyers who had fallen out of favor upstairs. There was Michael, who had missed an important deadline and cost the firm a case. There was Jennifer, who had argued with a partner about billing practices. And there was Robert, who had been down there so long that nobody remembered why he was sent there in the first place. They all knew David's story. Word traveled fast in law firms, especially when someone did something as dramatic as what David had done. Some of his co-workers thought he was crazy for throwing away his career. Others secretly admired him but would never say so out loud. "You realize you'll probably never get out of here, right?" Michael had told him during his first week in the basement. "The partners don't forget, they don't forgive, and they definitely don't promote people who embarrass them." David had nodded and gone back to reading his stack of boring insurance documents. He knew Michael was probably right. But every time he felt sorry for himself, he remembered Tom and Lisa's faces when they realized what they had almost signed. That memory made the basement feel a little less like a prison. The worst part wasn't the boring work or the windowless office. The worst part was feeling invisible. Upstairs, the important lawyers walked past him like he didn't exist. Nobody asked for his opinion anymore. Nobody invited him to meetings. He was just another piece of furniture in the basement, forgotten and ignored. But David wasn't completely alone. Tom and Lisa had kept their promise to stay in touch. They called him every few weeks to update him on their new business deal. After leaving Blake's office that day, they had found another company called Innovation Partners that offered them a fair contract with no hidden traps. "We're making less money than Blake offered," Tom had told him during one of their calls. "But we get to keep control of our invention. We get to keep building and creating instead of just being employees in someone else's company." "That's worth more than money," David had replied, and he meant it. Their invention was doing well. The smart computer program they had created was helping other companies solve problems faster and cheaper than ever before. Tom and Lisa were hiring employees and expanding their business. They were living the dream they had almost lost. As the months passed, something unexpected started happening. Other young entrepreneurs began reaching out to David. Word had spread through the tech community about the young lawyer who had saved Tom and Lisa from being cheated. People started calling him when they needed someone to review their contracts. First, David could only help them during his lunch breaks or after work. He would meet them at coffee shops and restaurants, reading through their contracts on his laptop while eating a sandwich. He never charged them any money. He just wanted to make sure nobody else fell into the same trap that Tom and Lisa had almost walked into. The phone calls became more frequent. David started getting emails from entrepreneurs all over the city. They all had the same story. They were smart, hard-working people who had built something valuable, but they didn't understand the complicated legal language that big companies used to take advantage of them. One evening, as David was leaving the office after another long day in the basement, his phone rang. The number looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "Hello, David. This is Jessica Kim from Innovation Partners." David remembered the name. Innovation Partners was the company that had given Tom and Lisa their fair deal after Blake tried to cheat them. "Hi, Jessica. Is everything okay with Tom and Lisa's contract?" "Oh, everything is perfect with their deal. Actually, I'm calling about something else entirely. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" David was walking to his car in the parking garage, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Sure, what's up? Well, I've been hearing some interesting things about you. Tom and Lisa speak very highly of you, of course. But I've also been getting calls from other entrepreneurs around the city. They all tell me the same story. There's this young lawyer who actually reads contracts carefully and protects small businesses from getting cheated. David felt his heart skip a beat. I just try to help when I can. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Innovation Partners is expanding. We're starting a new legal department, and we need someone to lead it. Someone who understands that our job isn't just to make deals, but to make fair deals. David stopped walking. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance to do what you're already doing, but full-time and with a real salary. We want to hire someone who will review all our contracts and make sure we're treating our partners fairly. Someone who will stand up and speak out when something isn't right. David leaned against his car, trying to process what he was hearing. Jessica, I should tell you, I'm not exactly in good standing at my current firm. I'm stuck in document review because I spoke out of turn. Jessica laughed. David, you're in document review because you did the right thing. That's exactly why we want to hire you. They talked for another 20 minutes. Jessica explained that Innovation Partners was different from the big corporations that David was used to dealing with. They were a new kind of investment company that focused on building long-term partnerships with inventors and entrepreneurs instead of just taking their money and running. We believe that when small businesses succeed, everyone succeeds, Jessica explained. But that only works if the deals are fair from the beginning. We need someone who can make sure that happens. By the time David hung up the phone, he was smiling wider than he had smiled in months. He sat in his car in the dark parking garage thinking about Jessica's offer. It sounded too good to be true. A job where he could actually help people instead of just reviewing boring documents. A place where speaking up for what's right was encouraged instead of punished. The next morning, David went to work in the basement as usual. But instead of feeling depressed about another day of document review, he felt excited. He had a decision to make, and for the first time in months, it felt like a good decision. During his lunch break, he called Jessica back and accepted her offer. 2 weeks later, David cleaned out his desk in the basement and said goodbye to his coworkers. Michael shook his hand and said, I hope you know what you're doing. Jennifer gave him a hug and whispered, Good luck. Maybe someday I'll be brave enough to follow your example. Even Robert, who barely spoke to anyone anymore, came over to wish him well. You're doing the right thing, kid, he said quietly. Don't let them convince you otherwise. David's new office at Innovation Partners had windows, real windows that looked out onto the city street, where he could see people walking by and living their lives. His desk was smaller than what he'd had upstairs at Thompson & Associates, but it felt bigger somehow. More important? On his first day, Jessica introduced him to the rest of the team. They were young, energetic people who genuinely seemed to care about helping small businesses succeed. Nobody talked about billable hours or client relationships. They talked about fairness and partnership and building something meaningful. Your job is simple, Jessica told him during his orientation. Read every contract that comes through this office. If you see something that's unfair or could hurt our partners, speak up. We want to hear your opinion, even if it's not what people want to hear. David's first case was reviewing a contract for a young woman who had invented a new type of solar panel. The contract looked fair on the surface, but David found a clause buried in the middle that would have allowed the manufacturing company to steal her patent if sales didn't meet certain targets in the first year. This needs to be changed, David told Jessica after reviewing the contract. Then let's change it, Jessica replied simply. It was that easy. No arguments about client relationships, no lectures about staying in his lane. Just a simple agreement that unfair clauses needed to be removed. Within 6 months, David had reviewed over 100 contracts and saved dozens of small businesses from being taken advantage of. Word continued to spread through the entrepreneur community about the lawyer who actually read the fine print and fought for fair deals. One day, while David was reviewing a contract for a new medical device company, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized but hadn't seen in almost a year. Hello, this is David. David, this is Harrison Blake. David nearly dropped his phone. Blake's voice was just as smooth and confident as he remembered, but there was something different about it now. Less threatening, more curious. Mr. Blake. This is unexpected. I imagine it is. I've been hearing interesting things about you lately. My lawyers tell me you've been making quite a name for yourself in the small business community. David wasn't sure how to respond. I'm just doing my job. That's what makes it interesting. You know, David, I owe you an apology. An apology? That contract you reviewed last year, the one with Tom and Lisa, it wasn't our finest work. My lawyers got a little too creative with the terms. You were right to speak up. David was speechless. Harrison Blake, one of the most powerful businessmen in the city, was apologizing to him. The truth is, Blake continued, I've been looking for a lawyer who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who will review our contracts and make sure we're being fair to our partners. Would you be interested in doing some consulting? Work for Nexus Corporation? David smiled. Mr. Blake, I'd be happy to review your contracts, but I should warn you, if I see something unfair, I'm going to speak up. Blake laughed. David, that's exactly why I'm calling you.